Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this very special session with Mary Ellen Ternes. She is our Environmental Division Service Award winner for the 50th year of the Environmental Division. This interview series is a part of the interview series that I'm conducting as the past chair of the Environmental Division. I'm Debalina Sengupta, Associate Director for the Tees Gas and Fuels Research Center, and it is my extreme privilege to be conducting these interviews with people of importance in the field of environmental engineering and chemical engineering. This is the 50th year of the Environmental Division, but it is also the celebration of the 50 years of United States Environmental Protection Agency, the NEPA Act, as well as the Earth Day. So with all of that environmental work going on for the past several years, Mary Ellen is very unique. She is an attorney as well as she is a chemical engineer. So with that background, I would really like to welcome you, Mary Ellen, for this interview session.
Thank you very much, Debalina. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm thrilled to represent AIChE, the Environmental Division, and I'm thrilled to speak with Debalina about this. I've been a devoted lifetime member of AIChE for a long time, and I'm a fellow, and spent many decades working on trying to fill gaps between environmental law and chemical engineering, because there's so much of an overlap, as we'll talk about here.
So, Mary Ellen, I believe that you have some introductory slides to walk us through your career as well as yourself, if you want to share them.
Debalina, are you seeing the correct slide?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, thank you, Debalina. And yes, I've got a few slides. For my background, we do say, I think that it is true that I do not meet many environmental attorneys like myself. Most attorneys don't have a technical background, and if an attorney has a chemical engineering background, they're generally in patent law. I think chemical engineering is a perfect background for environmental law, and I've utilized my chemical engineering throughout my legal career. But just as a little bit of background, I am an attorney, private attorney representing industry. I'm licensed in several states, including the District of Columbia. I'm a fellow with the AIChE. I'm also a fellow and president of the American College of Environmental Lawyers. I began my career in Superfund. I was out of Vanderbilt in 1984 with my ChemE degree, went to work for EPA immediately as an on-scene coordinator, where I responded to and remediated uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. Best job in the world, absolutely loved it. It taught me field chemistry, fate and transport of pollutants in the environment, toxicology, forensics, chemical forensics. And because chemical engineers understand chemical processes, it was a natural fit for me to go to a site that I didn't know anything about, and then intuitively put together the history of the site based upon my understanding of chemical processes. After that, I moved to another program called the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. That's a statute that governs hazardous waste, solid waste that is hazardous. I wrote permits for hazardous waste incinerators within EPA Region 6, and those were issued to industry. And I learned how to apply such a strict programmatic structure and write permits that industry would then implement. And then I left EPA and I joined a commercial entity called INSCO. It was a commercial treatment storage disposal facility that incinerated hazardous waste. I was the corporate compliance officer. I assisted with draft and negotiated Clean Air Act permits, Rickra permits, and TSCA permits as well. During that period of time, I decided, since I kept working with attorneys that didn't have a technical background, and because I was doing lobbying efforts in DC with the National Trade Group representing commercial hazardous waste incinerators, I decided to go to law school. And in law school, which I absolutely loved, I went to law school at night while I was working for the company during the day. I was able to secure a clerkship position with the EPA's Office of General Counsel. I went to EPA in the summer honors program in 1994 and worked in doing research for EPA in the headquarters office that in AIR, the Clean Air Act, and evaluated policy and wrote memos and did research regarding implementation of the Clean Air Act by the delegated state agencies and EPA. That was wonderful. But since then, I graduated with my law degree in 1995. And since then, I've worked as environmental industry defense counsel, done regulatory permitting, compliance and enforcement, litigation, transactions, the buying and selling of companies and assets. I've particularly worked in the same area regarding Clean Air Act permits, hazardous and solid waste permitting and regulation, emergency response and remediation, resource conservation, recovery, testing the limits of the definitions of solid waste, hazardous waste, particularly legitimate recycling. And I've been very active within both AIChE and the American Bar Association continuously throughout my career, and leading AIChE and leading ABA, and also publishing quite a bit. The two probably exemplary books would be I co-authored the Air Pollution Control Technology Handbook with Dr. Schnelly from Vanderbilt, and I also co-authored the chapter on new source review with the ABA's Clean Air Act Handbook. So that's basically my background.
That's an impressive background, I must say. And I would like to acknowledge that you are one of my role models in connecting science with policy and law and everything else that makes things work on the ground. So I'm very curious, and I would like to all the chemical engineers, especially the young chemical engineers who are either in college or fresh out of college, to know a little bit more of the projects and the work that you have done over the years in environmental as well as chemical engineering related work. So, but more importantly, what we have discussed, me and you, we have discussed is that not always do we have the idea of what the law means or what the environmental regulations are. So if you can walk us a little bit through that and the projects that you have done, that would be great.
Wonderful. Let's do that. I've got a slide. I want to take a step back. Anybody who has come to a session that I've taught with AIChE knows that I tend to take a step back and give an introduction to law so that the engineers understand the perspective. I like to use analogies. I think it's helpful. Before I get into the projects that are implemented pursuant to specific statutes, I want to explain where the statutes and regulations come from. So I analogize a regulation. I think our members within the environmental division are familiar with regulations and can confidently read the regulations. They read the regulations, and many, often our members implement the regulations as part of their jobs. For an engineer, sometimes I think the regulation is kind of like a number to a lawyer. I think engineers understand that a number doesn't mean anything unless you know how the number was derived. What does the sample look like what is the measurement that caused you to generate the number? How representative of the universe is the number? How accurate and how precise is it? What was the method? How was the number generated? What was the sample? And then what was the quality assurance of the number itself? What is the context surrounding that number? Well, so for engineers, I want to say that regulations are like that number. The regulations they have a history and a context and a provenance, just like a number does. And an engineer wouldn't look at a number and assume they knew everything, just like a lawyer looks at a rule and says, you can't know everything. You can't know everything just by reading the rule itself. So that's why I take a step back and provide a little bit of context. So let's begin with the beginning. before we have a rule, before we have a statute, we have a constitution. And no authority exists outside that authority that precedes it. So the statute cannot exist outside the parameters of the Constitution. So we begin with the Constitution first. So with the Constitution, we know in Article 1, the legislative branch, our House of Representatives and our Senate, they draft legislation. These are statutes. Article 2, the executive branch is the president and the agencies, and they implement under Article 2 the legislation. And then Article 3, the judicial branch, those are the courts. And the courts interpret the scope of that implementation and decide whether or not it was illegal. First, we have, after the Constitution, again, we have the legislature adopt statutes. And I have, just as an example, the Clean Air Act here. So the Clean Air Act is an example of a statute, and it's very specific. It's codified in the United States Code, and it's quite long. Typically, engineers don't implement the statute per se, they implement the regulations. So what is the regulations? Well, the regulations are developed by the agencies that are delegated that authority pursuant to the statute. So the Clean Air Act is delegated for implementation to EPA, and the EPA drafts regulations. And you're familiar, our members are familiar with the notice and comment process for developing regulations. So EPA implements, it drafts, proposes, finalizes with public notice and comment regulations, and then implements these regulations. And then our courts determine whether or not EPA and the delegated state agencies that also implement these actually have implemented them properly. That is consistent with the regulation, which has the force and effect of law, as well as the statute. So
I have a question here, Mary Ellen. I'm sorry. Does the courts do this on a regular basis, or do they do that only when there is some litigation or any other problem that arises?
The courts will take a case when someone petitions for review. So they can either file a claim, they can, for example, if EPA is enforcing a regulation and the entity that is the subject of the enforcement action does not agree with EPA, they can wait. EPA can sue to enforce the regulation, and the entity can object. Oh. And you go to court that way. Or sometimes EPA will adopt a regulation, and an entity that has participated in public comment or has other basis for standing can sue EPA and argue that EPA does not have authority to adopt that regulation. Usually they allege something like outside the scope of EPA's authority, or EPA's rationale is arbitrary and capricious. In this particular case, in the Massachusetts versus EPA case, states had sued EPA to exercise its discretion under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases, and EPA had declined. And states had sued, arguing that it was within EPA's discretion, and EPA had no discretion not to consider whether or not greenhouse gases should be regulated. That's a very interesting case.
Oh, yeah.
So with that background, to give you some context as to how a regulation is interpreted pursuant to the statute within the scope of authority by the regulatory agency and as interpreted by case law by the courts. Let's talk about some of the projects that I've worked on. Again, this is a slide that shows you the relationship between the actions of our Congress, the president, and the courts under the different articles of our Constitution. It all works together. That's context. So when I first got out of Vanderbilt in 1984, I went to work for EPA in Superfund. Some of the projects I worked on, it was so much fun. Superfund is a catch-all statute that is intended to provide a fund to clean up and protect the public health and the environment from uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. Rickra, the other statute I'm going to talk about, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, applies to ongoing business concerns that generate hazardous waste. Presumably, if Rickra regulates ongoing business concerns, then those ongoing business concerns will not become abandoned hazardous waste sites. So Superfund is sweeping up the mess that existed. Typically, there is nobody there operating. It's just an abandoned facility. One of the sites I worked on was the Bros Superfund site. It was the Bridgeport rental and oil services up in Bridgeport, New Jersey. That was number 3 on the Superfund list. It was a 13-acre PCB lagoon. I was working there with my company, INSCO, and we had a small on-site incinerator that we proved the efficacy of the incineration for that waste at Bros. We had to get permit equivalencies for that, and it was a long project. We didn't have to get an actual permit to incinerate the lagoon, but we did have to get permit equivalencies. It was really complex. We worked with the Corps of Engineers that had been delegated authority to implement Superfund for that particular remediation. That was a great project. And the next one I did, it was interesting, was the Vertac dioxin site in Jacksonville, Arkansas. Vertac manufactured herbicides, the 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid and 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid. And the still bottoms from the 2,4,5-T created 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorobenzopidioxin, the most toxic form of dioxin, the TCDD. And that was a really unusual site. That was when I was working for EPA as an OSC. So Bros and Vertac were really interesting projects. And they were both on-site incineration projects, which again led me to go work for a company that did on-site incineration that was a commercial TSD. Another project and types of projects I worked on were those, again, incineration projects under the Solid Waste Disposal Act, and particularly the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, Rickra. So for the Superfund site, the Bros Superfund and the Dioxin site, both those sites were Superfund sites, but they got Rickra permit equivalencies so that they could operate. Subpart O of 40 CFR 264 provided all the performance standards for operating incineration facilities that they're, completely combusting hazardous waste to achieve a 6.9 or 99.9999% destruction removal efficiency. That's what you had to prove. And you also had to prove removal of metals as well, removal efficiencies for those. But when I worked for my company, I was in charge of permitting the hazardous waste incinerator to make sure that we were in compliance. We did trial burns and we proved the DRE and the RE for these ongoing incinerators. Now, what's also interesting is that the regulation of these incinerators and the emissions became regulated in subsequent regulatory development under the Clean Air Act. So I had a lot of experience with incineration of waste from uncontrolled hazardous waste sites, as well as commercial waste that was developed, that was generated pursuant to Rickra and was destroyed at a permitted commercial hazardous waste incineration facility. But when I became an attorney, I used that experience in my work as an attorney and defended the Army's chemical weapons incinerators that were burning sarin gas. And that was really interesting. There was a Pine Bluff facility there in Arkansas. Pine Bluff, Arkansas, the Army contractor had applied for an air and a Rickra permit to incinerate the sarin gas that had been stored there, the nerve gas. And the solution was obvious. It would be very dangerous to transport the sarin on the highway. And there was a threat of course, tornadoes in Arkansas. So the solution quite properly was to incinerate the sarin there on site. And of course, the permits were challenged, as they often are. In this case, the permit was challenged by the Chemical Weapons Working Group just because they fought incineration. There were some allegations that didn't hold up in court, and we were able to successfully defend the permits. And it felt good because the sarin was destroyed, and and I think it was resulted in an overall much more safe situation there. In addition to incineration, as we know, the Clean Air Act, it regulates all sources of emissions pretty much, stationary sources as well as mobile sources. Other types of projects include projects under the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act regulates discharges to surface water. One of the interesting projects I had, I work with a lot of wastewater treatment plants, municipal wastewater treatment plants, like publicly owned treatment works, POTWs. I also work with industries that have discharge permits, and I work on entities that are applying for wetlands permits. But not all of the cases are that easy to solve. One of my clients was complying with their discharge permit until the point that they had a settling pond, and the geese were creating a lot of waste, and it was the geese that were giving us a lot of trouble in the discharge permit. So some of the issues are not necessarily complex technical issues. Sometimes you just need a goose gun to scare the geese away. Just as an example of the range of types of projects that we have. Another interesting type of project that I typically work with is projects under the Safe Drinking Water Act. I certainly work with water treatment facilities, public water supply entities, and assist with compliance under the Safe Drinking Water Act of water treatment facilities providing safe drinking water to the public, as well as compliance with risk management planning and things like that. But within AIChE, what I've really enjoyed is working on the UIC underground injection control permitting under the Safe Drinking Water Act for CO2 injection for tertiary oil recovery. And then also working with AIChE and the United Engineering Foundation through the Carbon Management Technology Conference on UIC Class 6, which is the permanent CO2 sequestration permit. In Oklahoma, where I practice, we have a lot of CO2 injection for tertiary oil recovery. And I've worked on projects where we've captured CO2 from an ethanol plant, for example, conveyed the CO2 by pipeline to the EOR fields, and then we inject the CO2 and recover oil that way. So it's really fun to work with AIChE on development, for example, of the UIC Class 6 permit for permanent sequestration, as well as the conversion of UIC Class 2 for EOR into UIC Class 6, working with EPA and the Carbon Management Technology Conference at the same time that we're actually implementing this in the field. So again, a benefit of working with AIChE is understanding and working with the folks that are developing these rules, while at the same time you're actually working on these issues for work. I think, Debelina, that's probably a good review of the types of projects I worked on.
Great. Thank you so much for this exceptional background. And I think you have applied all chemical engineering important theories and rules in practice. So that's great. So Mary Ellen, the obvious question that comes up is that you have seen most of these rules and laws being implemented over the past several years. How do you think has the community, as well as the industry and the chemical engineering community as such, have adopted to these changes and in environmental protection and environmental the division itself? How do you think it has come over the years? What are your perspectives on that?
I think as someone who's been in the field since 1984, over 35 years, I've been very proud of the role that the United States has played in development of I say, conventional environmental pollution regulation. Back then, years and years ago, in the late 60s and early 70s, Congress did a really good job developing these statutes. There were efforts to inventory the industry that was operating in the United States at that time, not just the industry, but the types of pollutants generated by those industries, and inventory them based upon their ubiquitousness as well as their hazard. With that inventory, there were priorities that were ascertained in a way, priorities that were sensitive to doing the most you could do to regulate industry and the pollution from industry in a way that would most protect public health and the environment. Again, based upon the inventory of operating industries in the United States and the types of pollutants, how ubiquitous and how hazardous they were. That was a really good foundation for the current set of laws and regulations we currently have. But what was interesting about that is that the prioritization focused on acute hazards, chronic and acute hazards. For example, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act focuses on and defines hazardous waste as those wastes that are reactive, corrosive, ignitable, and toxic. Well, yeah, that's like the Basel Convention also. Basel Convention also adds infectious. But the Basel Convention was amended in 2019 to include plastic. And we don't regulate plastic like that, and there's a good reason. I'm keeping us on the Safe Drinking Water Act. I'll direct your attention to the bottom left where I refer to plastic. Microplastics aren't specifically listed in the Safe Drinking Water Act. There is no maximum contaminant level for plastic. We have turbidity, but we don't have plastic. And one of the reasons we don't have plastic is because it's not toxic or ignitable or corrosive or reactive. It's not acutely hazardous. It might leach toxic molecules of maybe PFAS, polyfluoroalkyl substances, one of the PFAS molecules. It might leach some endocrine disruptors that might have been added to the plastic resin. But the plastic itself is recognized as inert. In fact, it is so inert that it escapes regulation. I'm going to back up just a little bit. It's not, again, microplastic is not listed under the Safe Drinking Water Act. There's no MCL. The Clean Water Act, as you see on the bottom right, isn't listed as a pollutant, a specific pollutant. It might be included in an NPDES permit under potentially like the Formosa plant in Texas. I believe it was in Texas, had an actual exceedance of a discharge permit limit for visible plastic. It might be covered as total suspended solids, but again, unless it's specifically listed like it was in the Formosa permit, plastic is not defined as a conventional pollutant. Also, plastic, again, it's inert. It's not a hazardous air pollutant. It's not a criteria pollutant. It is potentially a microplastic. Might be considered as PM 2.5, so it could be considered as particulate. We know that some studies have said that tire shred from cars makes up to potentially as much as 50% of the PM 2.5. But plastic itself is not a chemical identified under the Clean Air Act as a pollutant. And it's also not listed as a Rickra or Resource Conservation Recovery Act hazardous waste, again, because it's not ignitable, reactive, flammable, or toxic. At the most, plastic waste is regulated to the extent it is pursuant to the Solid Waste Disposal Act. And under the Solid Waste Disposal Act, regulation of plastic is delegated to state agencies, which manage it as litter. So, the question that you asked, Debelina, was how did we do and how are we doing? And I think the bottom line is that we did really, really well with environmental regulation for acute hazards. And now what we're struggling with are those hazards that we haven't quite gotten to yet. Like, we're still struggling in the United States to work with and deal and manage carbon dioxide. It's invisible, right? It's also a natural pollutant emitted from living things, but the amount that we generate and emit needs to be managed. But then we have the benign or forever because they're inert materials like plastic. Those just didn't fit within our original thought of what was acutely hazardous, such that it was regulated initially under these statutes. So our challenge is how we actually cover and manage to regulate these different types of materials that maybe are hazardous because they are not necessarily reactive, because they are actually inert, and because they last forever, because they're inert.
Yeah, that is a very good observation, Mary Ellen, that you just pointed out, that both carbon dioxide and plastics are the problems of the future that we're looking at this point of time in life, as maybe the next most critical things that we didn't think about when we started 50 years back. But also, as I'm a researcher, I am in the field of research, and we believe that we can change the world through research. However, the changes do not get impacted that much when it comes to legislation. So what do you think needs to be done in the next, let's say, 20 to 50 years for us to deal with these two major concerns, both carbon dioxide as well as the plastics?
I think that we have up to now, and this is, I'm going to speak for the United States, because I think the rest of the world does not have the issues that we have in the United States. Plastic, for example, is being aggressively regulated around the world. In the United States, though, we've seen this with COVID. We need our consumers and our population to recognize that they have a vested interest in regulating this material, such that they may need to change their habits. They may need to agree that some single uses for plastics, we don't necessarily need those uses. We may need, we need our population to understand that we need to elect people that will, we need to elect representatives that will adopt regulation that makes sense, that will adopt statutes that make sense for the regulation of this material. We like to think that, that we can just set aside the problem and have the problem solved somewhere else. Surely, if we just spend enough money, we can just have somebody else deal with the problem. But with plastic is so integrated with our everyday experience that we're gonna have to change our habits to deal with plastic, and we will have to elect people who will adopt legislation, bravely adopt legislation to deal with it. Our manufacturers are going to have some extended producer responsibility to deal with it, and we're gonna have to figure out how to collect post-use plastic and manufacture it in a way such that it remains valuable to support true recycling efforts. We know how plastic works. We've created a pretty chaotic mess with our post-use feedstock. It's just too broad a variety with plastic. On the CO2, I think we had a plan. We got derailed a little bit, but at some point we will probably turn back to CO2 management, whether it's carbon capture or whether it simply is preempting generation of large amounts of CO2 just by diversifying our energy mix and adopting something in addition to fossil fuel. And at some point, fossil fuel will be recognized as truly an alternative fuel and a bridge fuel. And we have seen the future with divestment of fossil carbon in the big investment houses. So we'll see moving on from fossil fuel at some point in the future.
That is a great observation. Thank you, Mary Ellen. So now I would like to shift focus to a little bit about yourself, And one of my favorite questions to all women in the field of chemical engineering is that how has been your journey as a woman in chemical engineering? It's a diversity question. How do you see that happening? Because you started at a time where probably there were very few chemical engineers, women chemical engineers. And what are your thoughts about that?
It was so interesting. When I was at Vanderbilt, we had about 10% of our class was female in chemical engineering. When I left Vanderbilt to work in industry, to work for EPA and then in industry, I never met another female chemical engineer. I was the only one. I had teams of men. I hardly ever met a woman. And if I met a woman, they weren't a chemie. They were generally a biologist. So I never met another woman. When I started going to law school, about half our class in law school was female. And then when I joined, became a full-time lawyer, it was, though female partners in law firms, we were still maybe 10% of us were female. But certainly in law, there were a whole lot more females. And now I'm active with Vanderbilt, the alumni council for Vanderbilt Engineering, and working with the chemical engineering department. And it's wonderful to see that 30 to 50% of our undergrad chemical engineer students are women. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. I also believe, truly and honestly believe, that a diverse team is more valuable, that a diverse team is more successful, because you all don't have, in a diverse team, there are many different viewpoints. The difference in variety of viewpoints reflects the life experience of the team members, where they employ different approaches to solving problems. I think you have a really great, robust, approach when you have a diverse team. So I really do look for diversity when I have a team and putting together a team for projects, because I just think you're just so much more successful with diversity.
Thank you so much. And I remember we did talk about the book that you have in the background, Silent Spring, from Rachel Carson, and the role that women have in thinking about environment in particular. So if you wanted to comment on that.
I do think that women, and I don't want to overgeneralize, because I know that many men, and I have partners that are biologists as well, but I know that women think about reproduction. Women think about the environment as a natural adjunct to reproduction, and that women do think about, from a holistic sense, our actions in the context of our environment. Now, a lot of men do too, but I do think that certainly there's a special place in a woman's heart for context in the environment, because of our interest in raising kids that are healthy. So, I've got 2 sons, and I care about their environment because I care about their health. And I also think too, and this may be because as a minority, women in the field were very much a minority. Another attribute or another value of a diverse group is that sometimes you can take risks if you're in the minority that you might not be able to take if you're sort of locked in with a majority conformity expectation. So I also think that sometimes those of us who are in the minority in a particular group, you as an outlier have an opportunity to raise issues that might not be popular. Sometimes environmental issues are not recognized as popular. Often in environmental, instead of being perceived as a problem solver, often the production side perceives environmental as the problem creator. When actually the lawyer says, look, if it's a problem from the environmental side, then eventually it will become a legal problem. So better to solve it up front.
Absolutely, absolutely. So now let us get back to the environmental division of AIChE. How did you get involved, and what has been your journey with AIChE in general, but also environmental division in particular?
Well, I came back to AIChE when as an attorney, because Herb Cabasis was the section chair or the division chair. And I sent an email to Herb, who was working with EPA, and I, former EPA, myself with EPA Region 6 and then headquarters in the Office of General Counsel. And I said, Herb, certainly there's a place for, an environmental attorney, chemical engineer who wants to stay active. And Herb was wonderful. He welcomed me with open arms and said, sure, Mary Ellen, you go ahead and be active in the environmental division. One of the first things I did was chair the regulatory and legislative group, or I guess it was legislation and regulation section. Of course, because I'm an attorney. It was a lot of fun. Worked with the climate change section, led the climate change section, created chemical and engineering and the law. I founded that group, assisted in the creation of the Public Affairs and Information Committee from I guess it was a governmental group before that. But, consistently worked with environmental division in programming and publication, particularly trying to fill the gaps between, in just chemical engineering and specifically that aspect of regulation, the context of regulation, including the scope of authority by regulatory agency pursuant to the Administrative Procedures Act, and then the impact of judicial decisions upon the actual regulation. So it's been a great 25 years.
That's it is very heartening to learn about, first of all, your journey as a chemical engineer and an attorney for the environmental laws and regulations. Everything that you have done is so much exemplary for so many young engineers. So what would be your message to the younger generation of today? Do you think they are doing the right things? How do you think they can look up to chemical engineering as a profession, as well as looking at alternate career options like yours?
Well, first I would say when we have our Green Career Day panel sessions at our meetings, the AIChE meetings, one of the comments I've heard in the past was, well, there's not a lot of environmental work out there right now. Everything's already cleaned up. That's not true. We may not have as many Superfund sites, but environmental regulation is an ongoing challenge. There's always a challenge to make sure that we can manufacture the goods we want, have the energy we want, live the lifestyle we want while we minimize the impact on the environment. So there will always be work in environmental for chemical engineers. And then the next point I would say is that AIChE allows you to truly, if you really love chemical engineering and you really love the environment, and you really want to, solve the toughest problems to help us achieve, the optimal balance of environmental protection and smart manufacturing, that you can do that within AIChE, because that's where you get all the perspectives, the government, academic, industry, that's where you get all the perspectives. But chemical engineering is an excellent background for a lot of different stuff. I found that my chemie background and the way I thought as a chemical engineer was perfect for law. It's just, people think that law is a lot of reading and memorization. I didn't think so. I thought it was, very much like I might have used words instead of numbers, but the critical thinking was identical. The analysis that we go through in law to analyze the problem, identify the issue, apply the rule, and then come up with a conclusion, a discussion about application of the rule to the facts. That's really a lot of what we do in chemical engineering. We're trying to figure out how to solve a problem. And we identify the rules and we apply the rules to the facts, or the physical and chemical constants of the material that we're that we're working with and how it will react to produce the product that we want to produce. I mean, that's very much like law. So I think the way that chemical engineers think is really a good background for law, but it's also a good background for a lot of other careers. I think any kind of career that involves manufacturing, production, and energy, particularly law that deals with clients that are active in those areas, is great for chemical engineers.
That's such a nice thought, and I think we are coming to the end of the session. So if you have any thoughts or any remarks, anything that's funny maybe that you remember from the interactions with the division, if you would like to share such concluding remarks, please.
Well, I just know that I've really enjoyed my time with the Environmental Division, and my dearest friends within AIChE are within the Environmental Division. I hope that our members, to the extent that they're watching this, realize that all it takes is an expression of a willingness and interest in becoming involved, and you too can benefit from these great relationships and the engagement with some of our most fun and interesting members that are leaders within the Environmental Division.
Thank you so much for this session. And I know we have been discussing about doing this for a long time, and thank you for giving your time and effort for putting this together. Thank you so much, and congratulations again on the Division Service Award. It is a very good recognition of all the years, and especially in the 50th year of the division, it truly recognizes your contributions to both the field of work as well as the service to the division. Thank you so much, Mary Ellen.
Thank you, Develina. Thank you so much.
Oh.